tension always simmered between them, a dangerous dance of stolen glances and unspoken rules. He was an untamed king who swore to protect her, keeping a respectful distance. That fragile peace shattered the exact moment she admired another man, unleashing a primal jealousy that would rewrite their entire history. Winter in the northern territories of Northumbria was unforgiving, burying the ancient stone fortress of Dunstanburgh under thick sheets of ice and snow. It was the year 1274, a time when the treaties between the human realms and the Lycan enclaves were as fragile as spun glass. Within the cavernous halls of the castle, a quiet but potent war was being waged, not with swords or arrows, but with heavy silences and stifled desires. Cullen Patterson was the alpha king of the Pennine. Pax, a ruler feared for his ruthless efficiency in battle and his absolute unshakable control. He was a man composed of harsh lines and cold authority towering over most men, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of a fractured kingdom. Yet for all his monstrous strength, his greatest exercise in restraint was entirely focused on one woman, Lady Riley Beaufort. Sent to his court as a ward from the southern human kingdoms, a political hostage dressed up in velvet and diplomacy, Riley had expected a monster. She had anticipated a life of fear, locked away in a damp tower, subjected to the whims of a beast. Instead, she was given the finest chambers in the eastern wing, a personal retinue of maids, and absolute freedom to roam the castle grounds. What she did not receive, however, was the slightest hint of warmth from the king who hosted her. Cullen had established a profound, invisible boundary between them from the very first day she arrived in his great hall. He never allowed himself to be alone with her, without at least 2 guards present. He never addressed her by anything less than her formal title. When passing her in the narrow, torch-lit corridors, he would press his back against the cold stone, giving her a wide berth, as though the mere brush of her silk gown against his leather tunic would cause the castle to collapse. To Riley, his distance felt like disdain. She was a woman of fierce intelligence and subtle beauty, with cascading auburn hair and striking hazel eyes that missed nothing. She spent her days in the sprawling library, translating old Latin manuscripts, or standing on the battlements, staring out at the frozen sea. She often caught Cullen watching her from a distance from the courtyard below or the high balconies above. Whenever their eyes met, his expression would harden into a mask of granite before he abruptly turned away. She assumed he hated her, a living reminder of the fragile peace he was forced to maintain. She was entirely wrong. Beneath the icy exterior, Cullen was a kingdom constantly under siege by his own instincts. The moment Riley had stepped out of her carriage months ago, the ancient primal wolf inside him had slammed its paws against his ribs, claiming her. Mate. The scent of her, a dizzying blend of wild roses, old parchment, and sweet rain, was a constant torment to his heightened senses. But Cullen knew the reality of their world. To claim a human noblewoman, a political ward would spark a war that would raze both their lands to ash. Worse, he believed his volatile, beastly nature would terrify her, breaking the gentle spirit he secretly revered. So he swallowed the possessive growls. He locked the wolf away in the darkest corner of his mind, chaining it with duty and honor. He would protect her, he would provide for her, but he would never, ever cross the line. He would endure the agony of proximity without touch for as long as she remained under his roof. The castle staff whispered about the palpable electricity that crackled whenever the king and the lady were in the same room. During the grand feasts, Cullen would sit at the head of the oak table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his chalice, his gaze fixed on a distant tapestry, just to avoid looking at how the candlelight danced across her collarbones. Riley, equally affected, but utterly confused by his mixed signals, found herself lingering in his presence longer than necessary, desperately seeking a crack in his armor. "My lord," she had spoken one evening, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the drawing room. The crackling hearth was the only other sound. "If my presence in the library disturbs your council meetings, I can take my studies to my chambers." Cullen had paused, his pen hovering over a scroll. He did not look up. "The library is free for your use, Lady Riley. You disturb no one." The sheer coldness of his tone had stung. Riley gathered her skirts, offering a stiff curtsy, before fleeing the room, entirely unaware of how Cullen dropped his pen the moment she was gone, burying his face in his hands as he dragged in a ragged breath, completely intoxicated by the scent she left behind. The invisible line held firm, a fortress built of denial, standing tall against the siege of their mutual longing. But as winter thawed and spring began to breathe life back into the frozen moors that fortress was about to face, a threat it could never have anticipated, the arrival of the southern delegation in early May brought a flurry of colour noise and unwelcome complications to the grim fortress of Dunstanburgh. The human king had sent emissaries to negotiate trade routes, a gesture of goodwill to solidify the existing treaties. Among these emissaries was Lord Trace Castillo, the younger son of the Duke of York. Trace was everything Cullen was not. Where the Alpha King was dark, silent, and imposing, Trace was golden, boisterous, and draped in effortless charm. He was a celebrated knight, renowned for his prowess in the jousting lists and his silver tongue in the royal courts. From the moment he rode through the portcullis, his bright blue eyes found Riley, and he made no effort to hide his immediate infatuation. For Riley starved of affection and simple conversation for nearly a year. Trace's attention was a welcome reprieve. He treated her not as a fragile political prisoner, but as a vibrant woman. He regaled her with stories of the southern courts, made her laugh during the dreary council dinners, and offered his arm to escort her through the castle gardens. From his place at the high table, Cullen watched. To the untrained eye, the Alpha King remained an unbothered statue of authority. But his closest guards noticed the subtle, terrifying shifts. The sudden drop in temperature whenever Trace approached Riley, the way the heavy silver goblet in Cullen's hand dented under his grip, the low subsonic vibration in his chest that sounded dangerously like a predator preparing to strike. Cullen's inner beast, restrained for so long, was beginning to gnaw through its iron chains. "He is touching her," the wolf snarled, as Trace placed a lingering hand on Riley's shoulder during a walk in the courtyard. It is diplomacy, Cullen's rational mind argued, though his jaw was clenched so tightly his teeth ached. The breaking point arrived on the final night of the delegation's visit. A grand banquet was held in the great hall. The room was illuminated by 1,000 candles, the tables laden with roasted meats and fine wine. The air was thick with the scent of pine wood smoke and the overwhelming, suffocating scent of Trace's expensive cologne, masking Riley's sweet rose fragrance. After the main courses were cleared, the strict formality of the evening dissolved. Musicians played a lively tune in the corner, and guests mingled freely. Riley stood near the massive stone hearth with her lady-in-waiting Beatrice. Her cheeks were flushed from the wine and the warmth of the fire. Trace had just excused himself to speak with his captain, leaving the two women alone. Cullen stood in the shadows near the archway, pretending to listen to his general's report on border patrols, but his enhanced senses were entirely focused on the conversation by the hearth. "Lord Trace is remarkably attentive, my lady." Beatrice whispered, a teasing smile playing on her lips. "I saw the way he looked at you during the feast. He intends to ask your father for your hand, when he returned south. What do you think of him?" Riley let out a soft, breathless laugh, fanning her flushed face. She glanced in the direction Trace had gone, her mind swirling with the evening's excitement and the lingering frustration of Cullen's perpetual coldness. She wanted to feel alive. She wanted to be desired. "He is charming," Riley admitted, her voice carrying lightly over the crackling flames. "And, well, one cannot deny he is undeniably hot. Truly fiercely handsome. Standing near him is like standing by a blazing summer sun. It is impossible to ignore." The word hung in the air. Hot. A deafening crash echoed through the great hall. The heavy oak table near the archway splintered as Cullen's fist drove right through the solid wood. The music screeched to an immediate halt. Conversations died in the throats of the terrified guests. The ambient chatter was instantly replaced by the terrifying, suffocating pressure of an alpha's unrestrained aura flooding the room. Riley jumped, her heart leaping into her throat as she spun around. Cullen stood from the wreckage of the table. His stoic mask was completely, irreparably shattered. His eyes, usually a cool, stormy grey, were glowing with a vibrant, unnatural amber light. The veins in his neck were thick, and a low, thunderous growl vibrated from his chest, vibrating the very stones beneath their feet. "Out!" Cullen commanded. His voice was a quiet rumble, but it carried the absolute, terrifying weight of his crown. The guests froze, paralyzed by the sheer dominance rolling off him in waves. "I said out!" He roared, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a crack of thunder. Panic ensued. Dignitaries, knights, and servants scrambled over themselves to flee the great hall. Trace, rushing back in upon hearing the commotion, took one look at the towering, glowing-eyed Lichen King, and froze. Cullen slowly turned his head, locking his predatory gaze onto the Golden Knight. The unmasked hatred in Cullen's expression was so visceral that Trace took a step back, instinctively reaching for a sword he wasn't wearing. "Leave us, Castillo," Cullen snarled, taking a slow, heavy step forward, "before I tear that pretty head from your shoulders." Guards quickly intervened, dragging a bewildered and terrified Trace out of the hall, and slamming the heavy oak doors shut, locking them from the outside. Suddenly, the vast hall was empty, save for the roaring fire, the overturned goblets, and the two of them. Riley stood frozen by the hearth, her breathing shallow. She had never seen him like this. The man who always kept 10 paces between them was suddenly closing the distance with the predatory grace of a stalking wolf. The invisible boundary he had so painstakingly built over the past year was being trampled into dust with every heavy step he took toward her. "My lord," she started, her voice trembling. "Hot." Cullen interrupted the word, leaving his lips like a curse. He stopped a mere foot away from her. Riley had to tilt her head all the way back to look into his glowing amber eyes. She could feel the intense radiating heat coming off his body. He was trembling, completely consumed by the raging war between his remaining sanity and his absolute possessiveness. "You find him hot," Cullen whispered, leaning down. For the first time in a year, she could feel his breath ghosting over her cheek. The scent of him, pine rain, and raw, unrestrained power was intoxicating. He is a handsome man, Cullen." She stammered, using his given name for the first time, cornered against the warm stones of the hearth. Cullen's hands slammed against the stone wall on either side of her head, caging her in. His massive frame blocked out the rest of the room, leaving her in a shadow of his own making. The restraint was gone. The stoicism was dead. "I have spent every waking second of the last 12 months tearing my own mind apart to keep my hands off you," Cullen gritted out his voice, a gravelly, desperate plea. "I have stayed away to keep you safe, and you stand in my hall in front of my court and look at another man." Riley's eyes widened, her heart hammering against her ribs as the realization of his words washed over her. He didn't hate her. He was terrified of himself. Before she could form a reply, Cullen closed the final inch between them, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent as a desperate groan tore from his throat. The king who never crossed the line had just shattered it entirely, and there was no going back. Flames crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the great hall. Yet they were entirely eclipsed by the searing heat radiating from Cullen Patterson. For a year, Riley Beaufort had known only the ice of the Alpha King, his rigid posture, his clipped words, his impenetrable gaze. Now, caged between his powerful arms, she was consumed by his fire. Cullen's chest heaved against hers, the raw vibration of his earlier growl still humming beneath his leather tunic. He kept his face buried in the curve of her neck, his breathing ragged, as if inhaling her scent of wild roses and sweet rain was the only thing tethering his humanity to his soul. Riley's hands, trembling and uncertain, hovered in the space between them, before finally coming to rest on his broad shoulders. The moment her fingers brushed the thick, dark fur of his mantle, a violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. "You thought I hated you," Cullen murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper against her skin. The words were not a question, but a painful admission. He slowly lifted his head, allowing her to see the agonizing vulnerability swimming in his glowing amber eyes. "Every time you looked at me with that quiet defiance, every time you offered to leave a room because you thought my silence was disdain, it tore me apart. You gave me no reason to think otherwise, Cullen." Riley replied, her voice soft but steady, the initial shock giving way to a profound, aching realization. "You would not look at me. You treated me as if I were made of fragile glass, or worse, a plague you wished to avoid." Cullen's hands moved from the stone wall, his large, calloused fingers gently framing her face. His thumbs swept across her flushed cheekbones with a reverence that stole the breath from her lungs. "You are a human noblewoman, Riley, the daughter of Duke William Beaufort. You were sent here to secure a treaty, a piece of parchment, holding back a war that would paint these snow-covered moors red." Cullen explained the heavy burden of his crown bleeding into every syllable. "And I am a beast. From the moment you stepped out of your carriage in the courtyard, my wolf recognized you. Mate, the other half of my soul. But to claim a human ward, to subject you to the violence and volatility of my nature." He squeezed his eyes shut, a muscle feathering in his clenched jaw. "I chose to starve myself of you so that you could live in peace. I built a fortress in my mind to keep you out." "And what changed?" she whispered, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She leaned into his touch, utterly captivated by the raw devotion in his eyes. "You called Trace Castillo hot." Cullen deadpanned, his amber eyes flashing with a sudden possessive darkness. "You looked at another man with desire, and my fortress crumbled into dust. The thought of him taking you back south of him, touching you, holding you, it broke every chain I had forged over the past year." Riley could not help the breathless laugh that escaped her lips. The sheer absurdity of it all, that a single modern, careless word uttered in a drafty medieval hall had undone the iron will of the most feared Alpha King in the North. "Trace is a charming fool, Cullen," Riley said, her gaze holding his. "He speaks in rehearsed poetry and empty flattery. He is a summer sun, yes, bright, loud, and fleeting. but I have spent the last 12 months falling in love with the winter." Cullen's breath hitched. "Riley, I stood on those freezing battlements every morning just to watch you drill your soldiers," she confessed, her hands sliding up into his thick, dark hair. "I lingered in the library for hours, hoping you would come seeking a book so I could hear your voice. I never wanted the sun, Cullen. I only ever wanted you." The last remnants of Cullen's restraint shattered completely. With a desperate groan, he captured her lips. The kiss was not gentle. It was a year of suppressed agony, of silent yearning and starved desires finally breaking free. It was demanding and absolute, tasting of rich wine and unfiltered passion. Riley melted against him, her fingers tangling in his hair, matching his desperate fervor. He kissed her, as if she were the very air he needed to breathe. His large hands sweeping down to grip her waist, lifting her effortlessly until her feet left the stone floor. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, Cullen rested his forehead against hers. The amber glow in his eyes had softened into a deep, stormy grey. "You are mine," he whispered, a sacred vow sealed into the quiet space between them. "I am," she agreed, tracing the harsh line of his jaw. But the quiet sanctity of their moment was brutally interrupted by the heavy, rhythmic pounding of fists against the locked oak doors of the great hall. "My Lord Cullen, open these doors in the name of the Southern Crown." It was Trace's captain. The real world, with all its political treachery and fragile treaties, came crashing back down upon them. Cullen gently set Riley back on her feet, instinctively stepping in front of her to shield her from the doors. The Alpha King's mask of authority slammed back into place, but this time he reached back, lacing his fingers tightly through Riley's. "Let them in," Cullen commanded softly, though his voice projected through the vast hall with absolute authority. The heavy oak doors groaned open. The crisp, freezing air of the castle corridors swept into the warm hall, bringing with it a highly agitated Lord Trace Castillo, flanked by his personal guard and several of Cullen's own sentries. Trace's golden charm was completely gone, replaced by a red-faced, indignantly furious scowl. He held a rolled parchment in his gloved hand, the royal seal of Duke William Beaufort, dangling heavily from the bottom ribbon. "You have assaulted an emissary of the Southern Kingdom, King Cullen." Trace spat, refusing to step fully into the room, clearly still intimidated by the sheer size and aura of the Lycan ruler. "Your unprovoked rage is a direct violation of the guest right and a breach of the peace." Cullen did not move. He stood tall, a terrifying monument of power, with Riley tucked safely behind his left shoulder. "You are still breathing, Castillo. Consider that my utmost respect for the guest right. Now why are you shouting at my doors?" Trace's eyes darted to Riley, his expression tightening when he noticed their joined hands. A sneer curled his lip. "I have not come to trade insults with a beast. I have come to collect my betrothed." The silence in the hall became so absolute it was deafening. Riley stiffened, her blood running cold. "You're what?" Cullen's voice dropped to a lethal subsonic register. Trace unrolled the parchment with a snap, puffing out his chest. "I did not come to Northumbria merely to discuss trade routes. I carry a decree from Duke William Beaufort and my father, Lord Reginald Castillo. The Southern King has approved a union between the houses of York and Beaufort. Lady Riley is to return south with me at first light to become my wife." He tossed the scroll onto the floor, letting it roll to a stop at Cullen's boots. "To ensure the permanent pacification of the northern borders, the ward Lady Riley Beaufort shall be released from her political holding and joined in holy matrimony to Lord Trace Castillo. This union supersedes all prior treaties." Riley's mind raced. This was never about trade. Her father and Lord Castillo were conspiring to unite their vast lands and armies. By marrying her to Trace, the Southern King was creating a unified military front right on the Lycan border. Trace's flirting his attentiveness, it wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was a calculated political maneuver designed to extract her from Dunstanburgh. My father did not write to me of this. Riley stepped forward, her voice ringing with clear aristocratic authority. I have consented to no such union. Your consent, my lady, is not required, Trace replied dismissively. Your father commands it, and King Cullen is bound by the old treaty to release you if a royal summons is issued. If he refuses, he formally declares war on the southern kingdoms. Trace crossed his arms, a smug, victorious smile playing on his lips. He believed he had checkmated the Alpha King. Cullen could either surrender the woman he desired or plunge his entire kingdom into a bloody, devastating war. Cullen looked down at the scroll. He let go of Riley's hand, stepping forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. He bent down and picked up the parchment. He read the words, his stormy grey eyes tracking the ink. Then, in one fluid motion, Cullen tossed the decree straight into the roaring hearth. No, Trace shouted, stepping forward as the dry parchment caught fire, instantly curling into black ash. You insolent dog, you have just declared war. I have declared nothing, Cullen said, dusting his hands off on his leather trousers, his voice chillingly calm. The old treaty states I must release a political ward to a royal summons. It says absolutely nothing about releasing my queen. The guards in the room gasped. Trace froze, the color draining entirely from his face. Queen, Trace stammered. You cannot. She is a human. She is Beaufort's daughter. She is my mate, Cullen corrected his voice, echoing off the stone walls, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute truth. He turned back to Riley, extending his hand. The question in his eyes was clear. He was offering her a choice. To take his hand was to sever her ties with the South forever, to become the queen of a Lycan kingdom, and to stand by his side against whatever armies her father might send. Riley did not hesitate. She walked past the ashes of her father's decree, placed her hand firmly in Cullen's, and stepped up beside him, facing Trace and the Southern Guards. You will ride south at first light. Lord Trace, Riley commanded, her voice steady and echoing with newfound power. You will tell my father that his ward is dead, but the Queen of the Northumbria, Pax lives. Tell him that if he marches his armies to our borders, we will meet him with the full fury of the winter he so desperately fears. Trace stared at her, utterly bewildered. The fragile, quiet political prisoner he thought he could easily charm and manipulate was gone. In her place stood a woman radiating fierce, untouchable authority, her hand tightly clasped in the grip of the Alpha King. You are making a grave mistake, Riley. Trace warned, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and wounded pride. You are choosing a monster over your own kind. Cullen took a step forward, his eyes flashing amber one final time. Get out of my Castle Castillo, before I show you exactly what kind of monster I can be. Trace swallowed hard, stepping backward until he reached the hallway. He turned and fled, his guards rushing to follow him out into the freezing night. The heavy oak doors were pulled shut by Cullen's sentries, leaving the king and his new queen alone once more in the warmth of the great hall. The silence that settled over them this time was not filled with unspoken tension or agonizing distance. It was filled with profound, unbreakable peace. Cullen looked down at Riley, a rare, breathtakingly beautiful smile breaking through his normally stoic features. He lifted her hand, pressing a tender kiss to her knuckles. Queen of the Northumbria Pax. He mused, the words rolling smoothly off his tongue. You realize what you have just done. You have bound yourself to a beast and likely started a war. I am not afraid of a war, Cullen, Riley replied, reaching up to trace the smile on his lips. And you are no beast. You are the man who spent a year conquering his own instincts just to keep me safe. I cannot think of a braver king to stand beside. Cullen wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flush against his chest. The invisible boundary that had tormented them for 12 long months was utterly eradicated, replaced by a bond forged in fire and defiance. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of wild roses, knowing that whatever storms the southern armies might bring his fortress was finally complete. Enjoying the dramatic twists of this medieval werewolf romance, hit that like button, share this story with your fellow fantasy romance lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the thrilling upcoming parts where Cullen and Riley face the consequences of their shattered boundaries. Your support helps bring more epic tales to life.